Okay, so well, we've had Lucio and Ujo. Have I hope I pronounced your name right. I've got questions about this, but has anybody got questions to either to either of the two speakers that we've had so far? So, Lucio, can I start with you, because you had this slide at the end of your presentation, which you didn't have time to show. Could you talk us through this, because this is this networked idea of redundancy that you want to talk about? Could you just spend a bit of time talking us through that?
Mark, do you mean this one?
No, the slide that you had after that. There was a slide after that, wasn't there? It flashed up on the screen. And
okay, I see. But that was, yeah, that was a slide I prepared for another goal. I mean, it is just discussing more on chapter 4 about the generation of meaning. So maybe it could be more useful discussing after Klaus' presentation, which is about chapter 4, because I have, I mean, questions to say, something to say about that chapter too. This slide was, I mean, now I get it. Just a second, because
well, maybe you can say, maybe look, this point that you're trying to make here, this attributive versus relational, is fascinating. And I don't fully understand it. I suppose my question is, isn't Shannon redundancy, in fact, certainly Shannon mutual information, Shannon mutual redundancy, this is relational intrinsically, isn't it?
No, I don't think so.
That's what I want to understand.
That's exactly the point. I mean, okay, so look at this slide. That is, this way we are marking, labeling actors with the attributes. Are they in the knowledge sphere, or in the production sphere, or in the rules sphere? Okay, consensus sphere.
Yes.
Okay, but these are attributes. These are not relations. Then we can calculate with Shannon-like redundancy, for instance, in terms of overlaps, as Loet actually does, and say, okay, we can calculate the entropy of this system. So what's the frequency in this section, in this section, this section?
Yeah.
There is nothing relational here, nothing. This is just attributes, the distribution of attributes within a set.
Okay.
There is no any relation in this approach. And that's exactly my point. That is why dealing all the book and all the perspective that I totally share, by the way, so that's obvious. I mean, needless to say that I totally share the view, the network view. But why don't use appropriate measures of redundancy appropriate to networks?
Okay.
Which are, for instance, if I may say, there is, I was just, okay, tell Mark.
Well, no, I mean, so I can relate this because I've looked at the detail of how Loet has done his calculations. Effectively, there is a table, and the table has the three headings of, you know, the attributes, as you call them, yeah. And you know, they're labels for categories of documents effectively. And yes, you're looking at occurrences of words within documents, and then measuring the entropy, and measuring the mutual information, and then the mutual redundancy. What I'm intrigued by is, how would you do that differently? So if you didn't have a table with the 3 headings, what would you have?
You can look at the connections and count, for instance, the number of connections linking the actors or the different actors. For instance, so let's look at this slide. So here we have.
Can I interrupt for a second, please? I think there's a misunderstanding on the methodology that I'd just like to spend a minute to clarify, which is in chapter 5. He is, I think, actually doing the links because he's actually identifying authors of a paper and their association of whether they're in industry, academia, or in government. 2 authors of the same paper probably actually talk to each other. So if the assumption is that the authors of a paper actually have a link because they co-authored a paper, they probably talk to each other, it's a de facto indication of a relationship between 2 actors. So if you have all your papers where it's only academia and you don't have anybody from industry and you don't have anybody from government, people are only talking to academics. That they are relationships in the data. So when I read it, I don't have that problem.
Okay, I think Lucio understands this. I think the point that Lucio you're making is slightly different.
Yeah, because the point is that when you are looking at connections in terms of dyads, then you are not looking at the structure, at the whole network, at patterns. You are looking at combinations between 2. If 2 are collaborating to the same paper, so they're supposed to have a connection. But then, in fact, you produce a network which is the network of the connection between authors writing the papers. But that's the topology of the network. And in this network, look, you can find recursivity, you can find paths, you can find exactly what you need. That is, how many redundant relationships are. For instance, how to go from this point to this other point. Are there many different paths, or is there only one path? Is there any cycle which is exactly recursivity? I mean, all 2nd order cybernetics is focused on the idea of recursivity.
Yes,
which disappears when you are calculating redundancy in that other way. And you can calculate, you can take into account, looking, for instance, at this other measure, which is the cyclomatic number, is called in graph theory. That is, you are measuring the number of cycles, at least simple cycles, linearly independent cycles in a graph. And that gives you the recursivity, a measure of recursivity. So you can operationalize the redundancy, but which is another way to do it.
Okay, thank you. That's what I wanted to know. Jamie, you had your hand up.
I wanted to give it as a comment on what I heard Richard say and Lucio, and I don't know whether I will catch what you're saying, Lucio, but it also applies to chapter 4. So
exactly,
for me, this Loet's book is enormously helpful because I look at the big picture and I think about it as a feed-forward system between different institutions, dus the political institution, the corporation, and the university. So when I read chapter 4, I do that in the context of that bigger picture. And when I read chapter 4, I think that Claude Shannon's measurement is not capturing at all the dynamics of reading and writing, which Richard Clavens is mentioning, because when we read and write, we're actually switching gestalts all the time. So there is nothing in between us. It's all happening in our head. And so what Loet is measuring, then I think he's measuring a scratch, and here I'm using George Spencer Brown. So he's literally measuring how a scratch is moving back and forward, and in that way he's taking Shannon's measurement, because Shannon was measuring electrons moving back and forth in telephone lines, and to kind of wonder how do we make sure that at the other side of the line that there is something coming out that is actually what we put in, and how do we avoid a disintegration of the original signal that we want to have faithfully reproduced at the other side. And so I think what Lucio is capturing, and also Klaus, when you're critical of chapter 4, is that just how literal are we going to take chapter 4? Are we going to assume that Loet is literally talking about the telephone line and measuring the entropy or whatever it's called? Or is he just trying to alert us to the scratches on paper that we call scientific papers that are moving back and forth and that stimulate our thinking? And now I would like to connect back to what Yushuo said about the different roles that we take. That is like in stakeholder theory, that they try to make us think about. Sometimes we think as the marketer, sometimes as the employee, sometimes as a community member, sometimes as the manager. So that when we work with the triple helix model, we actually, while we're working with it, we assume those different roles while we're thinking through the interaction between the institution. But we also need to recognize that the actors themselves take on occasionally different roles. So there is a level of fluidity that I think that Yasuo brought out very, very clearly by kind of saying these are different models, and we use them, and then they give us insight. And Lucio, what you're pointing out is the interaction. I don't know how else to say. You really put the emphasis on the interaction as opposed to the scratch and the processes that we call the discursive processes. But that's the title of Luke's book. So it's but you're capturing, I think, the temptation to over identify with the metaphor and confuse the metaphor with the reality. And now I'm not saying that you're doing it, but I'm definitely saying some people are doing it. And so that's the way I would like to frame your comment, if that is helpful.
I wonder, Yushu, can you? I wonder if you can say something about your thoughts about this.
Thank you. Yeah, so first of all, I have to acknowledge, so I'm not really the expert, in Shannon, in measuring, the interactions. But to me, my understanding of many confusions in the triple helix research is partially about, people are mixing different concept constructs, different layers of perspective together. So that's caused some challenges because, as I illustrated in the figure, there's three kind of the triple helix, triple helix of the actors, the university, industry, government, and the functions and the spaces. And they are very much interrelated. So this is quite complicated to measure. I think Loet, found a smart way to measure the synergy by focusing on the functions. Because if you are looking at the functions, if you are measuring the redundancy of the functions, actually, you also indirectly measure or reflect the interactions, their relations, because that is related to the taking the role of the other. So in Henry's word, it's called taking the role of the other, how university engage industry by taking the wealth production. So when they are taking the role of the other, so there is redundancy. But on the other hand, there are also communications networking. So when you are measuring the functions, actually you are measuring the outcomes of the network, the relations. So not simply about the three actors, but also you can calculate, you can measure, the outcome of the communication, because not all the communications are valid for the dynamic. So only when there is a redundancy, so this is the most effective communications, networking for innovation. So as I said, I'm not a network, but from my perspective, I think it makes sense to focus on the triple helix indicator. And even though the indicator sounds is a bit, from single perspective, but actually it's a measure the outcomes of more complicated interactions from the three sectors from different perspectives. So that's my response.
Thank you. Jerome, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I have some questions for Lucio, maybe some comments. Sometimes it's good to have a bit of controversy and debate. So I do welcome disagreement, because you can always sort of reach some higher understanding. So maybe I would just play the devil's advocate and say, I disagree with you, Lucio, that these are just attributes, and more in agreement with what Margareta was saying or trying to say, that one could interpret this image of the triple helix as a short shrift, not of particular attributes, say you have a university, whatever, but rather of, I guess, what Loet calls logics, or these regimes. We could talk about those concepts of the regime, the trajectory, and I guess the events that are occurring. So I guess it's just a short shrift, I would say, of how would you say, of organizing these logics and I guess the events that they sort of promote. Or Loet would say they're correlations of distributions of relations. So then I would ask if you think that there's a way to, well, before I ask the question, I would maybe comment that I'm always making these notes as I'm hearing stuff. So I'm thinking about actually, Lucio, yourself and your colleague Josef Wieland, who actually have developed this very interesting sort of discipline of relational economics, saying there is no pure economic organization. So even say a firm in this this circle of industry is not only thinking about profit. So I would say that where Loet's image really matters is in the center of these three domains. So where industry, let's just leave that on the side. So the profit maximizing logic is meeting the logic of creating new innovations, and also the regulatory logic of government. So that's where I would say what is relationalized in this language. To myself, I'm researching cooperatives. I would add a logic of cooperation on top of these three as well. So anyway, that's my perspective. I'll have maybe talk on that next month if I have the time. The question is, how would you respond, Lucio, to the idea that there would be sort of a double bind between this idea of the attributes and the relations? And do you think that there's a way to, at a higher level, then synthetically come to terms with these two different perspectives? On the one hand, you have the attributes; on the other side, the relations.
Lucio?
Thanks for the question. And I think I probably not the really the one can give a very confident response, because I'm not really myself is not really in the measurement. So probably I also have quite a superficial understanding about the concept. But to me, so my basic understanding is that the triple helix, requires you to understand, basically the interaction. So because without interaction, so there's no synergy. So I think it's up to how we understand the attributes. So we can also expand the concept of the attribute, to include other things. But anyways, in my terminology, I think the interactions is very, very important. But on the other hand, not all the interactions, as I said, are related to the triple helix synergy. So that's also the problem for many triple helix studies. So they found, a regional innovation system. They found evidences that the university industry government has links. So sometimes they have diagrams, mainly done by qualitative research. So they found, the relations. But I think this is nothing new. Almost everywhere, I think, especially in the developed areas, regions, we can all see the interrelations, between university, industry, and the government. So the links are visible. But still, some regions are more dynamic, some are less. So why? So of course, there are many other factors. But from the triple helix perspective, so it's about, how they're taking the role of the other. So taking the role of the other is basically the perspective to look at how the interactions between these actors come up with some synergy for innovation or not. Taking the role of the other means that that is really related. That means, you are university industries and the government both all engaged in knowledge production, normative control. So this is the mutual redundancy. So I see, to me, I try to cross the two perspectives. I really see there is really the supplementary elements between Henry's taking the role of the other and the Loet as the mutual redundancy of the function. Because when you are taking the role of the other, you have basically overlapping your functions. And only when you can measure this mutual redundancy, you can give some evidence to the taking the role of the other. Otherwise, if you only do qualitative research, you can hardly provide, very solid evidences, or you can compare here in this region, they have higher level, taking the role of the other, the other region is lower. So it's difficult, for qualitative research. So there is already some gap, cannot be filled by this, the new institutional approach itself. And then the new evolutionary approach, especially Loet's measurement, triple helix indicator, can fill the gap. So to me, I'm not really stick to the attribute and interaction network because I'm not the measurement expert. So I'm just trying to bring this relative abstract measurement into the more concrete empirical setting. I think it makes sense to me. I think I feel that to me the measurement, because it has also been tested, somehow it can be evidence that once the indicator shows the mutual redundancy is high, then there is a high level taking the role of the other. So that means they have a higher performance of the triple helix.
Okay, so I'm kind of minded that two descriptions are better than one, as a famous cybernetician told us once. And on that note, it perhaps is worth revisiting the theory from chapter 4, which, Klaus, I think you're ready to talk us through your interpretation of chapter 4.
Would it be possible? Because I don't mind that you should answer the question, but I was actually addressing that to Lucio. That was very enriching.
Well, yeah, I'm aware of that. Shall we come back to Lucio after Klaus has done his presentation? I think
yes,
that right.
You are the master.
This is an ongoing discussion. I wonder if there's a reason or an excuse here to break the rules of this session and ask Loet to respond to that. Loet,
I don't think so. I don't think so.
No? Okay. All right. That's fine.
Well, I had hoped, Loet. I have to say, unfortunately, I missed the last thing. And I wrote it, actually, my criticism, I wrote it to Loet only. And then he said, why don't you make it more public, and I did.
Okay.
But he said he would respond to me at some point when it's more personal. So at some maybe you want to do it separately. I don't care. But I think one has to be careful. I think there's a lot of metaphors going in there. Yes, one can calculate this, but if one gets to variables, more than 3 variables or 3 actors or 3 dimensions, then the calculus doesn't work anymore. And what I did is actually in 1972, I developed an algorithm that can calculate this without that. That means not making it dependent on the calculus that an analyst invents, but looking at the realities of the interactions. That's a totally different type of story.
Okay. All right. Well, this is fascinating. Lucio, I mean, Klaus also mentioned the business of attributes and connections, and this is what you're saying about connections relate. Does that relate to what Klaus is saying about conversation?
I have drafted in a meanwhile a slide that can clarify my point. I mean, just juxtaposing the 2 perspectives of the attribute and of the relational calculation of redundancy. So let me share the screen just for this slide. Okay. Where is it? Yeah, this one. Can you see it?
It's coming. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's suppose that we have 2 sets. One set can be companies, or maybe something that may be easier to understand is authors. And the other set can be papers or can be universities. So I'm now, just for simplification, reducing from 3 to 2, but it's just a little bit more complicated to make a tripartite network, tripartite graph. This is a bipartite graph. So what's the point? The point is that when we are establishing and searching for connection between companies and universities, or just labeling what is company, what is a university, or when we are looking at papers and papers co-authored or not co-authored by other, but just a single author, we are just connecting these 2 groups. Okay, one group and another group. Now, a bipartite graph like this one is always producing 2 projections. That is, we can build an author by author network, or if you prefer, company by company network, and a paper by paper network from this bipartite. This is a 2-mode network, and we can split a 2-mode network into 2 1-mode networks. So what are the links of this author by author network? The links are the papers, the shared papers. Okay, so here the links are the papers. Here in this other projection, paper by paper, the links are the authors. So here the papers are the nodes and the authors are the links. Here, vice versa, the nodes are the authors and the papers are the links. Now, what's my point? So the crucial, better than this, I cannot explain. I just squeeze my mind to find a visualized way to look at the difference. When you are on this bipartite network, when you are calculating Shannon's like measures, that is, you are calculating basically the frequency, with the frequency of the different categories. What you are doing, you are calculating the dyads. That is, if one is just a single, no dyad, or is in a dyad with others, or in a triad with others. Okay, you are just counting how many elements in each group, and then you calculate the logarithm of the frequencies and blah blah blah. But what's the point? Is that there is no any topology in that calculation. There is no any network. There is no any cycle, no any path, no any circulation, no any structure. That's my point. So my point is, I'm not saying, of course, that the Shannon-like measures are unuseful. Okay, are useless. Yes, they are, of course, and it's good that there are empirical applications and that we can find very interesting things, as Loet did. But my point is, provided that the whole approach, Loet's approach and triple helix is based on networks, why don't you use appropriate network-like measures of redundancies, which are taking into account the topology, that is the structure, that is how do you reach to some, how do you arrive to some outcome? And that's it, the dynamics is into that. Otherwise, what Loet did in the papers are pictures. So a picture in one moment as a Shannon-like measure is telling you that the frequency of the categories is this one. But it's telling nothing about the structure and nothing about the dynamics.
Okay, can I ask about that then? So, I mean, there's Ross Ashby was quite, he seemed to be quite clear that the Shannon entropy calculations were an alternative way of getting at the variety of a system. So if you measure the outputs of a system, it will give you some indication of counting the variety of the system. So,
yeah, but
so are you saying, so what you want to get hold of is the variety of the system, and you're saying that that's obscured by the way that the entropy calculations are being done. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that you are looking at two different views, two different perspectives. One is the variety of the system in terms of the
Oh, we lost you.
Looking at the varieties of the relationships within the system. And when you're dealing with relationships, you need topology. You need to look at the structure. You need to look at the paths and, if any, at the cycles, at recursive processes within, and the variety, much more powerful variety, comes from that, from the structure, from the recursive structure. You cannot see that through Shannon-like measures.
Well,
simply cannot. Sure.
Klaus?
Let me clarify. I think we should not confuse links with entropies. Entropy is just a flat measure of variety and how it's distributed.
Yeah.
But it can calculate, and that is the power of information theory, the link between the sender and the receiver, or between one unit and the other, one dimension and another. In some sense, these are quantifications of a network. One can decompose a lot of variety into numerous connections. And that is the strength, for example, of Ashby's decomposition, even though I think one of the things is that he did not understand the measure of Q, the interaction, and that's what I solved later on. But the point is actually that is a different kind of linking of variables. Now, the meaning of what Luigi says, that is a different thing, whether you talk about papers that link, or whether you talk about companies that interact. That's a different measure. That's not part of it. And that's why the issue of meaning is not there. It's simply saying there is a connection, and I can quantify the connection.
Okay.
Could I?
By the way, I would like to also mention again. I mean, Lucio mentioned here the calculus of redundancy. redundancy is the concept of redundancy as channel capacity means nothing to me, and I would love to know who thinks differently.
Mark, could I add a word here?
Yes, and Richard's got his hand up. So, but yes.
Okay, so I agree with the problems of, or the issues raised by Klaus and Lucio. I concur that both of them have valid logical presentations of their concerns, and I run into exactly the same problem from a different viewpoint of abstraction in the relationship with chemistry. And the solution I found for this was that you cannot use a simple predicate logic of just, which is used throughout mathematics in so-called model theory, of just simple sentences of subject and predicate. Yeah. You necessarily require, in order to describe the networks, such as Lucia mentioned, if you would, a bipredicate or a diploidic form of predication where the subject induces two forms of predicate, one with regard to that which it predicates, and the other with regard to the connections between the predicates. So this is not well appreciated among linguists at all, but for those people who attempt to reduce natural phenomena with soma, with bodies, if we say, they necessarily must describe both the contents of the body as well as the relationship between the parts of the body. So you can call this soma logic, or you can call it other forms, but it definitely requires two distinctions in the predicates. One, the content of the predicate, and the relations among the contents of the predicate.
Are you saying, Jerry, something similar to, I think we both know Joseph Brenner. Is it a similar point that you're making? So he's got this intermediate term in his logic.
Who?
Joseph Brenner.
Oh, no.
Oh, okay, all right.
It's in the theory of logic. Sometimes they refer to this as a distinction between isotonal and antitonal, but there's no clear linguistics, or it should say, semantics. It is part of the so-called Rutley-Meyer semantics of logic, but it needs further refinement in order to deal with problems such as those related by Lucio and Klaus. The chemists and biochemists have this under pretty good control in their language, but other domains, generally speaking, don't deal with quite this level of complications within graph theory. Okay. So for example, in Lucio's network that he showed, one could view one part of that graph, or one part of his bipartite graph, as the electrons, and the other part of it as the nuclei, and the connections between them being the bonding within a molecule.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Exactly.
What you're saying is that you wouldn't like to have the link explained or the connection explained.
You have
and
to
not
enumerate it.
Not
yes.
just the quantity. And what Shannon does, it simply says, this is the amount of connection and not the quality.
Okay, yeah.
Yes.
Right, thank you. I'm beginning to understand this, I think. Richard, you had your hand up briefly. Have you got?
Yeah, let's let some other people have a chance to speak.
Okay, Jamie?
Yes, I wanted to actually respond a little bit to what Jerry is saying and how it gets back to chapter 4 in Klaus. And that is when you were talking about your predicate logic and that you need a kind of some different logic. there are actually, and you see that very clear in George Spencer Brown's The Laws of Form, you're actually working with metaphors, and he has 3 metaphors he's very explicitly using in the first page. That is the meat cleaver, and that's Plato's metaphor that you divide the universe by your definitions, the circle and the container. And George Spencer Brown is switching between those 3 metaphors. And so when I hear you talk, Jerry, you are, I think there are 2 things going on. That is a mind that's switching the styles, each time it uses a different metaphor. And the mind, that is our body. And then there is the scratch on the paper that we produced and what that scratch signifies. And so what you call predicate logic, that is a way of talking about logic, and that comes with a set of rules, but there are people who are using it. And then your chemistry, or I don't know which, perplex logic, that is a different way of thinking about the same scratches, but with a different set of rules. And I think the challenge that we're facing today in the world is like, now, are we going to decide to always use one sign with 5 different meanings without really telling to people that they have 5 different meanings? Or okay, let's tell them they have 5 different meanings, but then each time we have to spend time on explaining, okay, this is one sign with 5 different meanings. Or are we just going to say, let's come up with 5 different signs, and then maybe we save a little bit of time and there is less likely a misunderstanding. And what I think with Loet chapters 4, we're really struggling with this problem of like, so what is it that Loet is trying to tell us in chapter 4? And we literally are struggling with this fact that if it means different things, can we then maybe just say at once it means different things, or what is going on here? And so I think this essentially gets to, there is a phenomenon that's called gestalt switching, and we're all switching gestalts, listening to each other and making sense of each other. And maybe we need to talk about that phenomenon, but which discipline should be in charge of talking about this phenomena? Should it be the psychologists? But they're not talking about it because they're busy with their computational theory of the mind. So shall we then just let it be and not talk about it? Or maybe Loet is the one who needs to create or help create the space to talk about the slipperiness of the meaning. And actually, Klaus, I'm also making reference to your latest presentations about the uses of language, and that there are these different models of usage, and that we need to talk about these different models coexisting or something. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, I wonder if I could make a connection then to what Klaus has been saying about conversation, because these are conversations. Now, but conversations are interesting things because they are not, well, you kind of see it in discussions like this. We are not in the business of transferring information from one person to another. Very often we're in the business of defending our own positions and defending our own understanding. And this seems to be, and we see it in international relations, of course. We've got a war since we last all met, which is absolutely about protection of identity, protection of boundaries. So how this is a real thing. How do we account for this if we can't do it with Shannon?
Well, let me say, I think the problem with Shannon, or I don't want to really say, but the problem with Shannon is you have a space, an entropy, and then you take it apart and look at the relationship within it. And information is always a measure of the reduction of the uncertainty. If you ask a question and you get an answer, you're uncertain about the question, you get an answer, you reduce it. But in conversation, that's what I was trying to say at the end, it's just there's also another element, namely that you increase the space. I think most technological innovations are actually the result of conversations that increase the spaces. That means you say something, someone else adds something to it, the space becomes bigger and bigger. And yes, at some point, maybe it converges again to a solution. The point is, this goes back and forth, just like evolution, actually. This is not just only a reduction. And okay, I think Shannon is mainly a reduction, and to me, conversation is also an expansion of the possibilities.
Right. And you would say then that that isn't a process of increasing maximum entropy. So if we are in conversation and a new concept arises in our conversation, that isn't simply a matter of a larger field for potential selection.
Well, this is a larger field. If you invent a new term, then you somehow have to readjust the whole system to capture that. Yes. So, then you have a different kind of, then you have a different space.
Yeah. Okay. But Loet does say, you know, this relationship between the increase in maximum entropy. What I'm asking is that what you've described? This expansion of this building a niche for communication, is that an increase in the maximum entropy, or is that too crude?
I mean, to me, entropy is a measure. It's almost independent of meaning. And what you're describing and what I'm agreeing with is actually a space that increases the semantic space, if you want. Yeah. And okay. I don't even want to call it a space necessarily, but the other possibilities are added, and this changes the whole conversation, if you want. And I don't want to be nailed down to a space that has dimensions and that one can calculate. Yes, one can do this in many ways, but it is not always so.
Okay. Mark, may I add something here that I think further clarify, or hopefully clarifies Klaus's perspective? If you have a probability distribution, it's always defined between 0 and 1. There's no other thing that's allowed within a probability distribution. And what Klaus is saying is that when you enter into a conversation, you now move to a different probability distribution, a probability distribution that contains more terms, more logical terms, more semantic terms, that opens up a new topology for the considerations being undertaken.
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
But I would not always say it's a probability distribution, because we don't know the probabilities.
But an entropy function must be a probability distribution.
Well, if you calculated entropies, yes, and you have to have probabilities. But maybe the entropy measure is not a good one.
Oh, I agree with you totally that the entropy measure as something to do with meaning in conversation is almost useless, because the goal of mathematics, in this context, is to make certain that the meaning of the sender and the meaning of the receiver are exactly the same.
No, not exactly the same.
Let me qualify this, Klaus, before you reject it, okay? This is the nature. This is the nature of mathematics.
Well,
this is the nature of the mathematical symbol system.
Yes, for mathematicians, yes.
This is the way you use mathematical symbols.
Yes.
And so that when someone else now uses a different symbol system, a non-mathematical one, and I would say that entropy at its root is a mathematical symbol system, but you want to switch to an alphabetic symbol system where the meaning depends on what the sender and the receiver understand about each other. And this is a different notion of how the symbol systems are being used.
Well, but I think what I wonder, you said the same symbol system. Well, a mathematician has his own symbol system. That is one.
Exactly my point.
And if you're a good mathematician, you have learned what everyone else accepts as the symbols. And that is not necessarily so in conversations. And I would say, I think it's a myth to even say that we could understand each other. I can never understand what you're thinking. But that's why I was saying, when I say I understand, that is actually a signal. I had enough. I think I don't want to need more. It's enough. And this is another signal which has nothing to do with understanding the other, but rather being satisfied with what one understands.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
So,
We are approaching well, in 10 minutes, we're going to approach the end of the session. So I want to give our three speakers, including Klaus, a sort of space for a final word. So Lucio, if I can come to you as part of that.
Sorry, may I interrupt?
did,
Sorry, Richard had his hand up.
yes, and no, I've seen Richard's got his hand up. So I'm going to come to you in a second. I do suspect that there is more agreement between Loet, Klaus, Jerry, Lucio than we might imagine, and I'm sure Loet will be able to articulate that after this session. But Richard, do you want to ask?
Yeah, very quick, because I think it's good to have the summary between the three of them. And going back to the reason that I think in conversation, at least that I'm here, I don't know about the rest of you, is actually to listen to someone who thinks differently, so that I get an idea that I find useful for my own problems that are somewhere else. That's what the Klaus to me is talking about, is opening up that space. I might do that by being offensive in terms of I disagree with you, but that's because of my own personality. But I get a lot of benefit from that when I hear the different perspectives. I hear the explanation, say, hey, I never thought of doing that. That could help me over here. That's why I show up, and that's why I think this is very helpful.
Yes.
So,
yes.
Thank you.
But okay, Richard, isn't that redundancy? Isn't that?
I actually agree with Klaus.
How do you define redundancy?
No. To me, I'm a human that has problems. I'm trying to solve my own damn problems. If I find a better way to solve a problem, I'll pay attention to it. Conversations to me a lot of times. So is that reducing redundancy?
Deep down, we all have the same damn problems. We just express them in different ways.
Well, I kind of agree with that, but I don't understand yours.
You don't know you don't. Okay. Look, so we got 10 minutes. I'm going to ask Lucio, Yujo, and Klaus just to say something, final comments to close the session. But thank you ever so much for this. Has been wonderful, really. Lucio.
Okay, so first I would like to say I share, I agree with Klaus and Jerry, and I add that if we change the methodological approach, moving from network analysis to agent-based modeling, we become able to take into account at the same time the two ontological domains, that is the attributes and the relations. Because if an agent-based model were well done, then we can look interacting attributes and relations. So this is, at least in just, I mean, intuitively, I think this is also what Klaus was saying about the conversation. That is, it is not more a closed space with fixed boundaries, but you can build an agent-based model where agents, actually I did something like that, where agents are generating new rules of interaction. And that is exactly the way to expand the space. And so changing, as Klaus says, rightly, changing the probabilities, because you are creating something new and you have to renew. It's a sort of continuous calculation which is never ending and it's never stabilized. And this is one comment. The other comment is that it's not a comment, it's a proposal to this. I mean, I think the chapter 4 deserves some more discussion. For instance, in my speech, I never mentioned meaning. Because I totally disagree with the Luhmann's approach of defining what is a meaning, and actually in this respect, also Loet. I mean, I have a different position with Loet also, because Loet drew his approach from Luhmann. I think that that's not the right way to look at the meaning generation. So, if possible, I think it could be a further discussion of what are the basic concepts that Loet discussed in chapter 4.
Thank you. Okay, Yuzhou, can you say it, your final comments on this fascinating discussion?
Yeah. Thank you. I think, given there's only a few minutes left, I want to stay with the time of my comments. I want to ask a question to Klaus. So, because you disagree with Loet's measurement about the redundancy. So my question is, would the meaning of redundancy be different if the redundancy is in a strong network or a weak network? Strong network means the actors in the network, they are familiar with each other and share the similar attributes. Weak network means that they certainly, they have less communications, they have different profiles. For instance, network between the business world and the university. So do you think the redundancy, the meaning, even though the measurement mathematically would be the same, but whether the meaning will be different in terms of the dynamic for innovation, if it's between the strong and the weak networks?
I'm not sure if I can give you a very simple answer, but I don't think that the measurement of redundancy that Loet proposes has anything to do with meaning. It has to do with channel capacity, literally. And the maximum entropy is a construct by the observer. It has nothing to do with reality in a way, but the observed entropy is observable, but it has nothing to do with meaning. And the difference between the two is channel capacity, let's say, of an engineer that has to do with he knows what the maximum is. Or we look at technology, you can measure maximum and then actual use, but this has nothing to do with what actually redundancy means in everyday life, and also in terms of Shannon's entropy, Shannon's measure. Redundancy is actually, probably Shannon developed actually his notion from cryptography, and he was working in the Second World War on decoding of messages. Well, if there's redundancy, then you can get more easily at the meanings of the particular things that are not said, and so redundancy is important. Or when you, in ordinary conversation, when you don't listen to a word or don't get a word, it doesn't matter that much because there's so much redundancy. You can look for one thing and the other and you get the same type of message. This is a very different notion than the channel capacity. So I think that there has to be, to me, that doesn't make any sense, this calculus of redundancy. I think one has to rethink that. But I don't know if that answers your question. But I don't really think I want to make kind of concluding statements. But I think one has to be careful, and this has to do with metaphors, to use mathematical formalism and then translate it into real life and think one has understood something. Yeah. That is the issue of metaphors. And metaphors are to me very interesting because I'm a designer also by background, and one of the great things of metaphors is actually that you can shift your perception to something totally different, and you see things differently. And that's where most innovations, in fact, come from. And I've studied metaphors in many ways. But the point is actually that shifts perception, and this is not really seen here. But if you use metaphors that are inappropriate, then you get sidetracked into something and you draw conclusions and you can be badly mistaken. So I think when we deal with mathematics and simply say network analysis, okay, fine. And now you go into companies and so maybe it helps, maybe it doesn't. But I think I would be very careful with the metaphors we use to interpret a link, or in this case, the entropy, etc.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
I think you know, therein lies the problem of econometrics, really. And I think it seems to me that these discussions are getting better, and they're getting better partly because of the quality of the book and the quality of the thought that's gone into this book. Some of you might disagree with it, but it's certainly inspiring some really perceptive and deep conversation, which personally I'm really I'm thrilled by this, and I'm sure as I'm sure you are. Thank you ever so much for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Jamie, when is it?
The next time is in April, on April the 20th, and now we will be discussing Chapter 6, Regions, Innovations, and the North-South Divide in Italy, but also Chapter 7, the Measurement of Synergy. And we will have 3 people to comment: Helen Lawton-Smith, Innovation Studies from the Birkbeck College in London University, Jerome Warren, Economics and Social Sciences Perspective from the University of Cologne, and then Richard Clavens also is going to give a comment, and Richard is here today with us, as is Jerome. So that's it for April the 20th.
Okay, so we'll see you then. Thank you ever so much. It really has been very rich and very rewarding today, so thank you. Okay, see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.